it did not only come up with a town in the heart of another town, but also we do have delegates from all over Africa, heads of state and their representatives making trip to Beijing, China to attend the 9th edition of the China-Africa Summit, FOCAC as it is known. That is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the 9th of its kind. And so this morning in our Kickstarter, we're going to be looking to the Africa-China relations, analyzing the forum and what it was, the 10-point program for the Chinese to Africa. And then it also begs the question, the debt diplomacy and where it's going to leave Africa at the end of these discussions and the handshakes that are going to happen between now and over the course of the next 3 years. This is a summit that happens every 3 years. Now, to just give you a backbone of it is that African leaders did convert in China last week for the high-level meeting with President Xi Jinping, making sure that his guests were comfortable, but also giving them confidence that they will be giving them about $50 billion in funding for different programs and development arrangements between China and the different heads of state. 53 of them were in China or well represented in China, minus Eswatini that is subscribing to Taiwan, and that's something that will come up in the conversation later on. But at the end of the day, we want to have a better understanding of why the China-Africa Summit. But anyway, by and large, why is everyone turning to Africa to quote-unquote have solutions or support Africa in finding its footing? I am joined by Dr. Allawi Ssemmanda, international relations expert, equally Mr. Ezra Byakutangaza, who's also a policy analyst, to give us their 2 cents. Later on, we're also going to be joined by Ahmed Hadji, international relations, that is going to also be adding his 2 cents to it. But I think my starting question is that in the 21st century, is this the version of scramble and petition for Africa? I'll start with Doctor.
Thank you very much, Priscilla, and the viewers. Well, I don't think this is, if we look at it in context of China-Africa or Africa-China cooperation, I don't think this is a scramble because it's not new. While Africa was being petitioned and being scrambled for, that is in 1950s, 1960s, 1940s at the start, we saw China coming into Africa. It was a very poor country, much poorer than sub-Saharan Africa. At the time, the GDP of sub-Saharan Africa was much lower compared to China. And we saw them coming, doing Tanzam Railway from that connected part of East Africa to southern part of Africa. At that time, a poor country coming to give you that kind of support. At the time when we are colonized, we saw China participating, funding, supporting, sensitizing Africans, working with them, the Obotes, on how to help their African countries gain independence. So I think in the context specifically of China-Africa, I think this can be described as a cooperation for development. You see, China, I've read much of their history where they say that their aim is to support building a community of shared future. Now, shared future, it means, Priscilla, your area is good, Ezra, his area is good, and I'm also good. Because if you are the only person doing well on the village, then you have problems. And this gives you even examples. Why do we see Africans dying in crossing seas, going to the Western world? Because they took whatever we had, left us poor. And we also, with our leaders, did not help ourselves. We kept into crying, we were robbed, blah, blah, blah. We failed to make it. And now we are following them. So the better thing to do, I think what China is doing, is let's work with these guys in their continent, benefit ourselves, also benefit Africans. Because I've seen they say that what guides their relationship with African countries are four principles: win-win cooperation, real results, amity, and I think good faith. So I think in that case I wouldn't say that the cooperation is showing signs of scramble and petition. Rather, it is building that community which they are talking. But again, look, when they were scrambling Africa, Africans did not largely participate in the scramble of their continent, but they were forced, either forced and agreed, or they bribed some of them. But today, we see African leaders, our leaders, full in this thing, participating. But let's remember, even FOCAC, before it came, we had ministers sitting and agreeing, African ministers, because that is what came first, discussing what should we do with African, with Chinese. And the ideas that came into FOCAC summit of 4th to 6th were ideas that were developed by ministers from African countries. And prior to that, there was a conference in Dar es Salaam called the Dar es Salaam Consensus, where African scholars, think tanks, civil society organizations from the entire continent met with Chinese people at University of Dar es Salaam, and they discussed what can we do. So I see that this can't be petitioning or scrambling for Africa, because there is input, unless you are saying that entire African elite group has participated in petitioning and scrambling for their continent, which I think would be
Dr. Allawi, what's your definition of cooperation?
The cooperation in this case, if you ask personal, I would say that is why we're working with either group of people or organizations for a certain defined vision or agenda. And in the context of what we are discussing today, the cooperation is you are working with, and by the way, this is about international relationship. If there is no cooperation or working together, aiming to achieving something, then there will be no cooperation. So in this context, cooperation is we are working and one and the other has to gain, not only one person to gain. But if the opposite of that would be exploitative.
Okay, all right, Mr. Byakutangaza. Your name is quite good in this conversation because it means enlightenment,
Yes,
you know.
thank you.
So
Yes,
please enlighten us on this 21st century. Is it a scramble and partition of Africa by yet another big power? Back in the day, of course, it was the major ones being the British. Then you also do have the smaller ones, the French, and these other smaller ones. But now we're seeing a whole new power that is coming to the forefront, and it seems to also want to have relations with Africa or a piece of Africa.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, and good morning to our viewers. Of course, in my opinion, once bitten, twice shy. It's not the first time we are having sort of a good-looking cooperation. Well, back in the days, in the traditional colonial times, it was coercion for us to cooperate. But even then, at the face of it, our colonialists, many African colonialists came with the Bibles, came yet with guns. And the major attraction was that Africa was and still is a basket of resources, raw materials for their industrial agendas. So in my view, Africa should be more than conscious in this cooperation. We know that China is an emerging superpower at the global level. So what does the first experience with the colonial masters teach us? It's not any different. Of course, we are aware of the neocolonialism approach, which is convincing other than coercion. And in the process of convincing, we have to bring out a sort of a win-win approach to lure Africans into this cooperation. Yes, without a doubt, it presents some opportunities for African economies, but like I said at the start, once bitten, twice shy. We must be conscious. For example, I was looking at the statistics of how much Chinese exports are coming to Uganda as an economy and how much of our exports have gone, which largely are in raw form, and the exports of Chinese to Africans, largely in software, electronics, and machinery, is close to over $1 billion US, compared to our 54 million US dollars exports. So, is it a new scramble for Africa? I think yes. I think yes. Okay. Although we can leverage on that, on the agenda of the Chinese, of China to become one of the superpowers, to also grow our economies. So what does that call for African economies? To tread carefully as we cooperate.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, leverage on China's agenda to develop Africa. Ahmed Hadji, you're most welcome. You come in at the exact point where we were, having, just a perspective understanding before we get into the deep of the conversation, China's influence on Africa, most of East Africa, and then Uganda. And the question at the table was, in this 21st century, could this be another version of the scramble and partition of Africa? We've had US Africa, Russia Africa, the Commonwealth, and name it. Now China Africa, these are continued powers that continue to want to take their stance on the African continent. Why does Africa be at the center of it all? Ezra here has mentioned the Bibles. They came with the Bibles, and it tickled something in my head. They brought religion with them, and in their religion, in the beginning, said, for example, in social matters, that marriage is only permissible between a man and a woman. Anything outside that bracket is surely a sin. Today, the very same religion, the very same people are coming out to tell us that no, we have edited that a little bit to now accommodate the other forms of sexuality that they want to be accepted in their communities, and enforcing that on us. And you have already seen the impact that has had on our economies as the African countries that have said no, that shouldn't be the case. Why should China be any different?
Well, I think one is it's a bit historical. African countries were very instrumental in getting China to the UN General Assembly, and then eventually the UN Security Council, because of the strength of the votes. That for me is really critical. So there's a historical perspective to this, and China also was very instrumental in supporting as many liberation movements, the wars that led to many Africans attaining independence. And having said that, also China is coming in for its strategic reasons. One is they're giving us, like for example, if you look at just the recently concluded forum on China-Africa cooperation, this FOCAC meeting, they're pledging about $51 billion US to the African economy. Of course, we all know that in exchange to that is they want to have access to some of these critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, some of these key copper, these key minerals that are very, very critical as economies are looking at positioning themselves ahead of each other when it comes to green technologies or green tech economies. So definitely, but they also need the markets. So Africa is a huge market. If you look at the imports actually that we get, what we buy as Africa from China is almost like around, I think as of last year, 2023 was about $173 billion US. You can talk about the trade deficit, that what we export is lesser because we export, I think, around 109. So and we want to really close that deficit by enhancing industrialization, agro exports, and China needs Africa to push back these so-called they have an agenda. They've always had this agenda of how do they get back to where they are, the center of humiliation. How do they push back the global rules-based order that is US-led? So they are actually countering US as well, and they need Africa. So you need Africa if you really want to have access to the UN. You need Africa if you really want to have access to the critical minerals that are going to determine the economies of the future. You need Africa if you need the markets. Right now, some of these critical minerals are the solar panels, the products that come from these critical minerals, of which the largest deposits are in the continent of Africa. You're going to see that for example, they've put a lot of taxes for them to sell electric vehicles or solar panels in Europe. So the alternative market is Africa. So when you see them pledging over 51 billion in form of loans and private investments, they are looking at leveraging the African market. And they're also looking at that historical continuity. When Z was saying that we need to redress these historical injustices, we need to remake the global world in a way that is fair. So it's not something that is going to be Western-led and they're going to come and preach to us. So certainly you would see that they are increasing their influence. We've just hosted the G77 plus China. So they are they are close to the global south. So I think in that engagement, you saw them actually presenting themselves as the alternative trade partner for the global south. Mm-hmm. So all this, China is trying to assert its global dominance. China has ambitions to get to the top of everything. China wants to take over the UN because you cannot have access and the control and the influence of the UN without Africa. So you need Africa from multiple fronts. So definitely China is not going to be as different as any other player, because it's about interests. It's about interests, and whoever is going to have access and the influence of the globe needs Africa.
Okay, all right. Now, as you have mentioned, all I've had you say is them benefiting, at them, like it's them that are getting the better deal, then we are getting the better deal. So at what point does Africa get the better deal, and why do we have to be the alternative market? No,
unfortunately, because certainly, like I did mention that our exports to China is close to about 109 billion as of last year. So definitely there are opportunities, there are jobs, because we export agro, related products. Mm-hmm. And across the value chain, there are jobs. The challenge with China is where we should be getting much is where we're not leveraging our opportunities. For example, they are interested in the raw materials. They are not interested in adding value here, investing here. For example, if you look at most of the critical minerals, they have a larger base ownership of close to about 70% of some of these critical deposits. But they take the raw materials. So when they take the raw materials to China, they're exporting the jobs, and then they will be bringing back the finished products. Eric Dangote, one of the richest Nigerians, says that they export poverty and bring in, they export the jobs and bring in poverty as well.
That is why President Museveni is continuously telling us that we need to rethink our raw materials.
Absolutely. I think value addition.
We're going to end up being on our knees all the time, which then brings us to the debt conversation that comes out of this cooperation. Dr. Allawi, the China-Africa Vision 2035 is aligned with China, its own vision at 2035, seeking to consolidate China's status as a great power. And is this helping Africa in any way to attain, is Africa helping them to attain their status? And that is knowingly or unknowingly?
Thank you very much. Allow me just for a second. Let's look at the industrialization process that has taken place in Uganda. If you've not been to a place like Kapeka, Mbale industrial area, we are now exporting, for example, tires. There are things we are exporting done by private Chinese individuals that before we were buying them either from Turkey, from Italy, and Uganda now is earning some serious dollars from this kind of business. When we talk about trade, at this FOCAC, I saw President Xi announcing free tariff, extending it to about
33 countries.
33 African countries, including Uganda. So this is going to increase market of Africa to Chinese market, but it is also going to help our trade to grow, because as he clearly put it, for the case of Africa, as of 2023, we are close to 282.7 billion USD. But of course, China had a bigger part. But with this kind of free trade, I think we are going to get more. And then we should not fear the so-called debt. Let me tell you, the UK had a debt for Canada and the US. It took them 60 years to pay their debt. At one time, they thought UK would not make it. So when it comes to Africa and we are given a debt to develop ourselves, then we are told that diplomacy, the trap. And what is the theory behind this? International, it's simple. It's politics of the West that don't take this debt so that you can chop. Let's see what African Development Bank says. We need close to 130 to 170 billion annually for Africa to grow in infrastructure. Who is willing to give it to us? Not the World Bank. When they came up with Build Back Better under the G7 in 2021, there is no any African country that benefited from this project from the G7. So I think that is the problem. I go back to the question which you said. I think the African countries, if we open ourselves, will benefit from these projects. For example, under the 10 points they have brought, I saw them explaining, for example, industrialization, advancement of technology, where they are saying they are going to support African countries with peaceful nuclear advancement. They have also promised 1 million jobs. I don't know how this will be done, but at least in the explanation given that the Chinese firms and private companies that will come to Africa, they hope they should be able to create these kind of jobs. But Priscilla and dear viewers, what we need to know is that as Africans to benefit from this, Africans must be alert. Alert in a way that we must know what we need. I'll give you African leaders.
Well, as Africans, we just see it from here, and we never know what matured in those.
In 2016.
Let me just, if I may interject actually a bit on. I entirely agree. China is not the main cause of all this debt accumulation for the continent of Africa. So we've had many other debts before. The challenge with the debts that are acquired from China is lack of transparency. Because many of these debts,
what do you mean in this case?
Because you know very well, Dr. Allawi, that half of the debts that are acquired from China are not disclosed. Yeah. And usually there are tensions, and that there is a correlation between the social tensions that you saw on the streets of Kenya, vis-a-vis, because I mean, they acquired close to about, now it's about 8 billion US dollars to work on the standard gauge radar. And right now, Kenya has a debt of about 82 billion. So many of the Kenyans didn't know these things. And the challenge with having debts that are not disclosed, if you have weak governance structures, there's corruption. Now, the challenge also with the Chinese loans is if they are concessional loans. Concessional loans are loans that you pay within the long term. You're not under pressure. They're not like standard commercial loans. The challenge with the concession loans is they will tell you that the Chinese company has to do the job. They will tell you that it's the Chinese materials that have to do the job. Exactly. You know very well that that kills local industrialization that you're talking about. And I think for me, let me just, with one point and then I'll pass it back to you. A case in point is in 2015, we acquired 200 million US dollars to upgrade Entebbe Airport. You know very well that, of course, it's not a liquid asset, so they would not place it as a collateral. But we have to, all the revenues for the next 20 years from Entebbe Airport will have to go to China. And then we had to even put in some bit of a cash stake in the issue account, meaning that if we fail to meet our end of the bargain, then Entebbe Airport is gone. Okay. So I don't want people to assume that debts are bad, but I want us to look at good debts. Are they transparent enough? If they are concessional loans, do they allow local development, for example? Why do you say that it's a Chinese company, Chinese material, even when you're giving us long-term loans? Yeah, so I think for me, my issue with my concern actually with the Chinese is the loans, not the Chinese generally. The Chinese loans they are not transparent. They're usually structured in a way that the Chinese want to still have that leverage,
Ezra,
influence at the UN, influence in your economies.
You talked about
but debts are not bad.
The responsibility of Africa's growth lying on its leaders. And what Ahmed there is pointing out there is something that is a challenge, and it's going to be a continuous challenge. In light of it, if you want to look at it from a good perspective, a debt diplomacy as we want to call it, where does the responsibility of continuously developing Africa in terms of agricultural advancements, industrialization, infrastructure development lie away if we were to take away such relations and corporations?
No, of course, like Ahmed highlighted, it puts us at a disadvantage. This cooperation must be very well understood, and African leaders interest themselves in restructuring the terms of this cooperation if they are to make sense in advancing our agriculture. And we need the cooperations. That's not something we can defy. But what are the terms of the cooperations? What have we done an exhaustive cost-benefit analysis? For example, we are talking about the China investment in the infrastructure. What does that translate to the common Africans? What does it make sense in terms of elevating their socio-economic status? So I think what can the African continents or African economies do? He talked about it, the governance issue and the transparency of these loans that we are acquiring. We are ranking the highest in corruption levels. So even with these corporations, if Africans do not take it upon themselves to present themselves as leaders in the fourth industrial revolution, then the corporations will do nothing except to sink us deeper in our debt burdens. So I think the African leaders should understand that we can do something on our own, but also should understand that we need to live within our means and invent ways of how productive can we be within our means. For example, our recent budget, more than half of our budget is going to debt financing. Yeah. What does that speak to our development? Let me tell you, Priscilla, if we decided to pay our domestic revenue to our debt financing, then we would not have any funds to operate our economy. Yeah. Yeah? So it is something that the African leaders must understand, and the earlier we start to face it, the better. There is the youth unemployment is at its peak. The urban youth are hitting the street. I was one of those that came on the street on the 23rd to say no to corruption. The cost of these vices, the cost of these closed door meetings may not be known to us Ugandans, and to our disadvantage as young people. We are going to face the wrath.
Because you have to pay.
Because we have to pay this.
Pick up the pieces.
Yes. But you see, Africa is, when you're speaking in terms of Africa, these loans are bilateral. Africa is not negotiating as a coherent front. So these loans are negotiated between a country and China. So which puts some of these African countries to compete among each other. So these are, and just also say that, more especially concessional loans, these are good loans, long-term loans. You borrow, but then you pay long-term. They've helped Africa close infrastructure gaps. We've had connectivity. Connectivity has really helped. People are able to move. You can imagine the long hours. You needed, before the standard gauge rail in Kenya, for you to move from Nairobi to Mombasa, you had to use almost 10 hours. But that has been cut to almost half, which is about 5 hours. I mean, you can see some of these other, special highways that have been constructed. Within a few minutes, you can connect. So connectivity really has really helped. Okay. The issue is the nature of these loans and the interests that are around these loans are not just looking at helping countries to grow, but it's about leverage, because you need these countries when you are pushing something at the UN, or you need these countries if you are negotiating for jobs and your own companies to come in. And I think we need to push the idea of negotiating as a collective Africa.
I think where is the role of the African Union? Perhaps they should be the frontiers of any relations with any other power and superpower. But Dr. Allawi, there's something that you had talked about and mentioned a little bit earlier, that at such summits, who goes to represent the countries? You talked about how you were dismayed that our very own president stayed back and just sent a message. And then you do have the Vice President, Jessica Lupo, having some of those closed-door meetings to try to make sure that they can come back with some signed agreements, especially for the SGR and other investments that we're looking to develop infrastructure-wise for our country. But so far, not any fruit that has been born of those interactions there. And you were of the view that perhaps if it was president to president, you could have better deals coming through at the end of the day. So it begs the question, who do we send, and how important it is to send as fine authorities at the end of the day to have a more meaningful bargaining power out of these relations?
Thank you, Priscilla. I'll answer this question, but allow me to say that I think the biggest problem we are having as Africans is the tyranny of experts, where experts move or match with the ideas advanced by the competitors of Africa. Remember, and this we should not forget it, and this is not to say that China can't change. We need to know that China, as he put it, that century of humiliation, this is a country that was colonized. They understand what colonialism means. They understand that a poor person, yes,
not in the African context.
And you see,
so it doesn't mean that because you are both poor,
you see,
it's at the same level.
You see, this is very perspective. A visionary leader who is very alive of what happened, because they want to allay the humiliation. They can't cause humiliation to another country unless they don't see. If you don't see what happened to you, that doesn't mean that many views saying no to what you're saying, that the many are right. Because that would mean you've not learned from history if you want to do what other people did. For example, any country would be very unwise to do what the French have been doing in West Africa. People have been asleep, but now they are saying you must pack your things and go because you have not worked for our best. So I think China must have learned lesson. And let's not forget, for example, there is something he alluded to, the escrow account, the clauses put in, if you read like clause 15.1, where there is waiver. I think it's been very long, because I've really read so much about the loan we got for NTV airport. There isn't anything like this airport can be taken. No, but tell me, wait, my brother. Yes, there is a default clause, 15.1.
Yeah, then but then the capacity of the country
there is waiver.
Because you see, there are two things here. I mean, we're here to educate the public. And fortunate enough, me and you are professors. You see, the idea is if you come in to support an economy, I mean, I don't have an issue with that, because China is really a key trade partner, but it's also one of the credit partners of the continent. Even the 51 billion that they've allocated,
the biggest creditor.
Even the 51 billion that they've allocated at the recent FOCAC, 29.9% is 29 billion is a loan. So the others are coming in as private investments, which are going to be investments led by the Chinese. Which actually comes with some of their materials. We can talk about the Chinatown and whether the Chinatown is of an advantage to our local business or something. It's another conversation for another day. But we all know that the Chinatown experience kills our local industrialization in the long run. But the point here is that investment is critical to facilitate global connectivity. The challenge with the nature of these loans is the capacity of the economy. So that clause vis-a-vis the 20 years collection, because all the revenues collected from Entebbe, from the Chinese investment, go to pay that
escrow account.
Escrow account. Now the issue is our economy, the way it's performing. You know very well, Dr. Allawi, that we at a certain point will have to default. But then the one thing that we are now on the mercy of the idea that they might not do what others have done. But we all know very well that, which is speculative. We all know that when you default, they take the airport.
Allawi, he was answering something else about
yes, I just wanted to also clarify that as well so that he understands.
Yes, so to conclude on that point, I think that these things are very catered for. If you read clause 15.4, 15.1, I think there would be nothing like seizure. And if anything, there is no any example of any African country or any country in the world that has lost their property to these guys as a result of the loans.
But Zambia nearly. Zambia nearly. When Zambia defaulted, when Zambia defaulted, you know that they were nearly. You know,
nearly doesn't mean this.
But it still gives China leverage.
Of course, the trajectory.
And it's not to the advantage of an African country.
On who should lead us or who should... in 2018, I attended a conference which was for scholars from Africa, and they had ministers, they had government officials, and they were discussing how the 60 billion are allocated to China, how it should be shared. And at one point, I will not mention which country, but you might guess very right. Because, you know, they sit East African region, Southern Africa, Central Africa, and at one point, that specific group where I was, as they were looking for technocrats to discuss how much should go, and the people from the group were like, oh, well, our leader has gone for shopping, and at that time you can imagine what that group got. So I think we need to have we need to have scholars, we need to have civil society organizations, we need to have government fully represented such that they can discuss. I'm not saying that because the vice president moves with the full backing of the country, and she had a very great team, I'm very sure. Minister Keruriam was with a very good negotiator. But I think we need to follow up, because I know after this there is going to be ministerial meetings to discuss which country to get what, which group to get what. So I think in that case we must be very much alive and know what we need. For example, there is a project they talked about under livelihood project. We are already doing this under the South-South Cooperation. So I think in this case Uganda would position itself and indicate, for example, industrialization on trade, because we need that trade, and the market for our goods, especially that we've been given free tariff. And we'd also need to have more funds in green development, which they've also talked about.
Ezra, the Zambia thing has come up. They are defaulting on the loans by end of 2022, and then at $18 billion in external debt, so at least 12% being owed to China. Of course, in March there was a whole restructuring in there, some claims written off. It begs the question that if China is already not having a good experience by and large with its African partners, why would it want to inject more money in it?
And that's why I said we must be very careful. Our African leaders must be very careful on how we are transacting. And you know, for Zambia it was $18 billion, and for Kenya it's now $82 billion. But
8 billion for China.
For China. For us, it is about $25 in Uganda, but 20% of that is Chinese money.
20%.
20%.
Yes.
20% of
and
this
80%?
debt. 80% of course is to the other multilateral
it's not
donors.
Only China that
it's not only China, but of course we must be conscious.
Yes.
That tells you who is benefiting from this cooperation. I think the motivation for China to continue to invest in Africa, even when some African countries already are defaulting, like Zambia. Of course, Kenya now, we don't know what the fate will be, because the finance bill, like the President Ruto was stressing when Kenyans were opposing the bill, he was saying, you know, Kenya is being suffocated by the debt burden. So the motivation of the finance bill was, you know, how can we mobilize to settle this or bring this debt burden to a reasonable, sustainable...
You know, my land brother, my concern, Priscilla, is if UK can pay for 60 years, and this developed city.
Maybe Doctor,
60 years they did not. 60 years back, they did not have. They were like us.
No,
60 years. Yes, they were at the
level. If I can finish my submission.
Let's bring this conversation to perspective, Ezra, with your permission.
Yes.
We know for sure that China has its ambitions to push back, the US-led global order.
Yes, yes.
And that is one of the strategies.
To hold captive.
To buy influence at the
Africans.
UN because they need the strength of the African votes. We know for sure that they also want to have access to these raw materials. For example, Zambia has an abundance of some of these critical minerals that they will need, copper and others. And no wonder they've given them a very good deal. They are revitalizing Tanzam. You know the Tanzam railway of Tanzania, and they've pledged to really support that rail connectivity. But they are doing it because they know that this rail was going to deposits where there are critical minerals. So its debts are not bad. Good debts are better,
finally,
but debts that work also
Ahmed,
for African continents as well.
2021, when they gave Africa $40 billion US dollars,
yes.
How has that transformed Africa?
Well, concessional loans have been of help. Good loans that you acquire a loan and then you pay in the long term. I mean, they've opened up economies, connectivity. People are able to move goods. People are able to move. I've given an example of Mombasa, Nairobi. Half the journey is cut off. Goods are moving, business is moving. Okay. The challenge with half of their loans that are not disclosed in weak governance systems in Africa is it opens room for corruption. Okay. So who is going to be paying? The people paying, and they're not getting any value.
Use of these partnerships, nevertheless.
How we make it is to know what we need and discuss very well. I will tell you, China has written 4 papers on how to work with Africa. As of now, there is not any policy clearly led by the continent on how to work with China. I think that is a very, very big concern.
So we're going to be in a deeper call.
But
Ezra, your closing remarks?
In my view, I think our African leaders should be awake to the fact that the responsibility to develop our economy is entirely on our shoulders. Dr. Annabelle here was talking about the connectivity of the infrastructure. For example, the NTV Express. Today, if you don't have a tariff to pay, you cannot use the Express. So what can this corporation work towards translating into?
But some of these large investments, we don't even have capacity to repair some of these loans. They're not giving us value as well. So it's a good Chinese experience as well.
As we speak, we have other matters to look at. For example, when will they get their digital numbers to their cards? And that conversation is coming up right after this break.